Welcome everyone. First, we would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 8 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree and Dene First Nations and the Métis Nation. We would also like to thank Apple Schools for making it possible to bring in our wonderful guest today. Michael Kusugak is an award-winning author from Rankin Inlet, Nunavut. He is currently living in Manitoba. Michael was encouraged by his boys to write his first book, A Promise is a Promise. And now he has written over a dozen children's books and won several awards, including the Vicki Metcalf Award for a body of work in children's literature. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to our special guest. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you. We have grade 3s this morning, you said? Well.
Sorry, preschool to grade 3.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my name is Michael Kusugak. Actually, Kusugak was my father's name, and it means icicle. So I think it kind of fits I kind of fit the name because we come from a very cold place, colder than Fort McMurray. And I've been there a few times, telling stories in all kinds of schools all over Fort McMurray. We used to travel before we got COVID. And anyway, right now I live in Manitoba. This is my house. I made this drum, and this painting was done by a friend of mine from Igloo in Nunavut. And it is called Nunavut. Nuna is land and Vut is hour, so it's land hour. But English is backwards, so in English we would say our land. So anyway, Kusugak was my father's name, and we didn't have that name as a family name because we Inuit, it is not our culture, in our culture, to have surnames. So everybody in my family had individual names, and mine is Akbarlu. It means immature bowhead whale or young bowhead whale. And we are in Manitoba. And if I go down that way in my truck for about an hour and 10 minutes, and I end up in a place called Winnipeg, Manitoba. And, and out here, about 2 blocks away, there's a huge lake called Lake Winnipeg, and it goes way up there somewhere. And sometime this weekend or next week, I want to put my boat in there, and I'll go exploring all over the lake and fishing, hoping to catch some fish. But if you go that way to the very north end of Manitoba, there's a huge bay, and that bay is called Hudson Bay. And Hudson Bay, I discovered when I was working on this book. I wrote a book called T is for Territories. This is an alphabet book. And it's these alphabet books are made by an American publisher, and they're all about Canada. So there's one for every province. There's one here, somewhere in here. Some right there. This one is about Alberta. C is for Chinook. And this one is about the 3 territories, about Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. And they asked me to write this. And because it's an alphabet book, I have to choose a subject for every letter of the alphabet. And so for A, for the letter A, I picked April 1st, 1999. And April 1st, 1999 was the day that Nunavut, the territory Nunavut, was born. So I have to write little poems, one a very, very short poem. In April 1999, politicians came to sign an amendment to the Constitution to add Nunavut to the nation. And so that's what this alphabet book does. And if you look on this page, who does that look like? Well, that's me. And this drum is that drum up there. But I picked the letter H. For the letter H, I picked Hudson Bay. And when I was working on that page about Hudson Bay, I decided, I really don't need to do any research about Hudson Bay because I have lived there all my life. So I know everything about Hudson Bay. Well, I decided I would take a look to see if there was anything I missed. And sure enough, when I checked on the internet about Hudson Bay, I discovered that Hudson Bay is the second biggest bay in the world. The only one bigger than Hudson Bay is the one in India called the Bay of Bengal. And in 2015, I went there to India to see Hudson, or to see the Bay of Bengal, but we still have the second biggest bay. And if you go to Hudson Bay and you go to the very, very north end, there's a tiny little place that we call Nauyat. And Nauya means seagull, because there are big cliffs there where seagulls come to nest every summer. And when I was a little boy, that's where I lived, in Nauyat. And when I was a little kid, we used to climb up and down the cliffs, and we would gather seagull eggs. We would fill up our pockets, we'd fill up our hoods, and any bag we had, we'd fill them all up with seagull eggs. And then we would climb back up to the top of the cliffs, and we would walk home. And then we would cook the eggs, and we would eat them. And seagull eggs were the yummiest eggs I have ever had. Well, Nauyat is right on the Arctic Circle. In English, it's known as Repulse Bay. We don't know why it's called Repulse Bay, because we had never heard of anything called Repulse or anybody called Repulse. So anyway, I lived there, and because it's right on the Arctic Circle, in the middle of the winter, the sun doesn't quite come up. It almost comes up over the horizon, but then it goes back down again. In the summer, the sun doesn't quite go down. It just goes around and round and round and round all day and all night long. So in the winter, it's almost always night, and in the summer, it's almost always day. And when I was a little kid, early in the morning, my father would get up. He would go outside. He would look at the weather to see what it was going to do. And then he would take our sled and he would turn it over. We used these huge sleds. They look like this. And they have two runners and cross pieces that we call naput. And these ones, this one I got from somebody in northern Quebec in a place called Kusugak. And it's got plastic runners. And today, our sleds have plastic runners. But when I was a little kid, we didn't have plastic. So we used frozen mud. It was actually peat moss that was cut up into tiny little bits and mixed up in a pail with water. And then my father would put it all along the bottoms of the sled runners, and he would let it freeze. So we ended up with this layer of mud all along the bottom, frozen mud. And when it was all frozen, he would plane it with a regular, hand plane. And then he would take a piece of polar bear skin like this, and a kettle of water. He would pour the water on the polar bear skin, then he would rub it along the bottoms of the sled runners. And he would let the water freeze. So we ended up with this nice layer of ice all along the bottoms of the sled runners. And that's what we traveled on. And when my father was all finished icing the sled, he would roll it back up. He would move it back and forth to make sure it was nice and smooth. And then we would take all our stuff out from inside our igloo. We would put them on the sled. We would roll them up in huge skins and tie them all down. And then we would hitch our dogs to our sled and we would go traveling all day long. Well, where we come from, there are no trees. There is not one single tree that grows where we come from. And because we have no trees to get in the way, we hitch our dogs all on separate lines. So every dog has his very own line. We might have 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 dogs. They all have their own lines. The dogs that like to run get the longest lines, and the lazy ones get the short ones. And when we were going along, the dogs would jump over each other over and over and over and over until their lines were so tangled that they couldn't run anymore. We would stop. My father would take all the lines off the dogs. He would untangle them all. My mother would get us some lunch, and after lunch, we would go traveling all the rest of the day. And of course, sometimes it gets a little cool. The coldest day I remember was -52. And if you're going to be outside all day long in really, really cold weather, you have to wear some really, really warm clothes. So we wore the warmest clothing in the world. I had a caribou skin coat, which was like a sweatshirt with a hood, and it was made of caribou skin. And this is a caribou skin. And my inner coat had fur on the inside, so I had caribou fur right up against my skin. And on top of that, when I was outside, I would wear another coat made out of caribou skin, and it had the fur on the outside. So because this is really quite thick, when I was a little kid, I spent a lot of time looking kind of like, you know, and even then, when I was sitting on the sled for a long time, just bouncing up and down, after a while, I would start to get cold. And when I got cold, I would jump off the sled. I would run along beside the sled until I got all warmed up. Then I would sit back down again. And sometimes I didn't even have to jump off because we would hit a bump and I would fall off. And then I'd have to run to catch up. So we traveled like that all day long, and at night, when we stopped, my father would build an igloo. When the igloo was all ready, we'd go inside, we'd bring all our stuff inside. My mother and my grandmother would light what we call a kudlit. It's a huge, big seal oil lamp. It uses seal oil for fuel. And I have one here. This is just a little one that we got from a friend of ours in Rankin Inlet. And the ones that we used were like this big. They were huge. And so they were really, really heavy because they're made of stone. And it has the depression on the top here. And so you put seal oil in here, and then you put a wick all along the front here. And when you light it, it looks like a whole row of candles all lit up all along the front. And my mother and my grandmother would light one of those, and they would start to cook us something to eat. They would heat up the inside of the igloo a little bit because sometimes it was really quite cold. And then they would make up a bed, a nice big bed with lots of warm furs. And every night, when I was all finished eating, I would go to bed. And when I went to bed, I would say to my grandmother, "Ananatiak, unikakto alawit." And my grandmother would say, "Unikakto sa kangin nama. Ananatiak, unikakto alawit. Unikakto sa kangin nama. Grandmother, please tell me a story." But I have no story to tell. "Grandmother, please tell me a story." But I have no story to tell. And after I asked her many, many times, she would finally say, "Okay, settle down and I'll tell you a story." And my grandmother told me some of the most wonderful stories I have ever heard. When I was a little kid, my most favorite story was the one that goes, "Ananat yaki maktawyuk, kupanawatu gulong migoy garayak tawyuk, palatatat-yuk." You like that story? It's a story about a little kid and her grandmother, and they got left behind all by themselves in their igloo. And then a little bird came, a little white bird, a snow bunting. It broke the window. It said, "Palatatat, you can," flew away. And that was the story. And I really loved that story. And I would ask my grandmother to tell it to me over and over and over until she got tired of it. And then I would have to ask her again, "Ananatya kunikakto alaukit." And she would say, "Unikakto sa kangin nama. Grandmother, please tell me another story." But I have no story to tell. But of course, my grandmother always had lots and lots of stories to tell. Well, my people are Inuit. And ever since I learned English, and I started learning English when I was 6 years old. I don't think I learned any English when I was 6, but maybe I started learning when I was 8 years old. I have been reading a lot. I read and read and read. And one of the things I really like to read about are Inuit, because I like to figure out what people think of us, Inuit. And I have read that we have been around, Inuit have been around for 4,000 years. I've read that we have been around for 6,000 years. And then somebody else wrote us something in the magazine that said, Inuit have been around since the last ice age. And you know that ice age ended 10,500 years ago. So if that is true, then we have been around for more than 10,500 years. And they think that we walked across the Bering Strait when there was no water there during the last ice age, which is kind of very strange. But I really don't believe that, I think, like everybody else in the world, we don't like to walk all that much because walking is really hard work. When we walked from one place to another, we had to carry absolutely everything. We had to carry our bedding, we had to carry our tents, we had to carry, if we were going somewhere forever, we have to carry our kudliks with us so that we wouldn't freeze to death in the winter. And when our kids got tired, we put them on our packs and we would carry them too. So it is really hard work. And we used to do it when I was a little kid. I used to be one of those kids that would get put on top of my father's pack, with the tents, with the bedding, with all the pots and tent poles and everything. And we had dogs that carried other stuff we had, and we would walk and walk and walk until we got to a place where there were caribou or where there was a nice river to go fishing in. But it's really hard work. So I think we didn't walk from Siberia to Alaska. I think we went by boat because we had invented a boat. And the boat we invented looks like this. This is a model kayak that is the kind of kayak that was made in my part of the north, in the territory Nunavut. And it is made of very, thin pieces of wood because we didn't have very much wood to build kayaks with or boats with. So we only used, strips of wood, all the wood that we could find. And if we didn't have enough wood for the ribs, then we made them out of bone or anything we could find. and we covered them with sealskin and sewed them so they were waterproof. And we paddled these things. And we have been known to paddle these things for a long, 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 long way, and up and down rivers, across lakes, and everywhere. And this is not the only boat that we invented. We also invented a boat that we call umiak. And an umiak is a huge boat, a huge open boat. And some of them are something like 30 feet long. And they're open, and we carried our dogs, we carried everything. We carried our kudlets, we carried our kids and our wives and everything else that we needed to carry. We carried them, and we paddled these boats, and we would sail them if we had to go a long way. So I think that is the way we came to North America. And if we came more than 10,500 years ago, then there was nobody around. And we came to this really cold, place, one of the coldest places in the world, and we decided to stay there. Why? I think it is because where we decided to stay is one of the most beautiful places in the world. It is absolutely gorgeous, and you have to go there to see it. And we have lots and lots of animals. We have caribou, and we eat the meat of the caribou. We had lots of seals, and I have a sealskin vest here. And so we had lots of seals, and we have to feed our dogs, and we have to feed them really well because we depend on them for our survival. And we have lots of polar bears, we have whales, and all kinds of animals. And this time of year, the birds begin to arrive. Geese and ducks and little birds, all kinds of birds arrive this time of year in the spring. And they come to build their nests and to raise their young. And in the fall, they all fly away. Millions of them fly south every fall. So we had everything we needed, and the rivers are full of fish. We have some of the nicest fish in the world called Arctic char. And we also have grayling and trout in the lakes, and all kinds of food to eat. And because when we arrived, there was nobody around, we could go around asking, how do you live here? What do you eat? How do you dress? What do you live in? How do you travel? How do you hunt? How do you do all this stuff? Because there was nobody to ask. So we had to figure it out. And along the way, we invented some absolutely amazing things. I think one of the most amazing things we invented was the igloo. Because the igloo is made out of snow, and it is designed very specifically to contain heat. And in a place where there's very little heat in the winter, you have to contain every bit of heat that you can. And the igloo is absolutely perfect for that because it is made in the shape of a dome. And we all know heat rises, so it rises to the dome of the igloo, and that's where we live. We don't live on the floor because the floor is always cold. And so we invented all these things, and we invented boots, and we made them out of sealskins. And these boots are really warm, they are light, and they are waterproof. So along the way, we even invented waterproof boots. Long before anybody invented rubber boots, we had waterproof boots. So, and what else did we invent? Toys. We invented toys, and here is one of those toys. This is called an ayagak. It is made out of seal bone. It comes from a great big seal that we call ugyuk. In English, they're known as bearded seals because they have a beard. And this bone has a little hole right there, and that's where the tendons used to go through. And I attach a little stick to it on a piece of string. And what you do is you have to flip the bone up in the air, and you have to catch it in the little hole with the stick. Ah. Well, it's not going to work today. Ah. But it goes, if you practice, you can get it into the hole. So after a while, we had everything. We had tools, we had toys, we had harpoons, bows and arrows, all kinds of things. And then we started to multiply. There got to be more and more and more Inuit. And today there are Inuit all across the north. There are Inuit in Siberia, there are Inuit in Alaska, there are Inuit all across northern Canada, and there are Inuit in Greenland. We all speak the same language with many different dialects. We eat the same kinds of foods. We wear the same kind of clothing, and we tell the same stories. And these stories are really, really, really old. And how did we get those stories? You see, when we got to be so many, we had to make rules. We had to make rules about how to take care of young people so we can raise them to be respectable adults. We need rules about how to take care of the old people, because the old people have been around for a very long time and they have all this knowledge that you have to learn before they pass away. And you need rules about how to take care of the land because it sustains all the animals that you depend on for food and clothing and oil and all kinds of things. And so you need all these rules. You need rules about how to live in peace. And the rules work so well that in all those thousands of years that we have lived in one of the coldest places in the world, we have never had a war. No wars. We don't have warriors. We don't have chiefs. And so we don't even have a word for weapon, because we have never had to defend ourselves from one another, because we don't do that. It's in our rules. So how did we teach those rules? We taught them through the stories. The most famous person in our stories is a man called Kivio. My grandmother said Kivio was born a long time ago, so long ago that he was the very first person on earth. I used to have a little joke with my grandmother. I would say, "Grandmother, if Kivio was the first person, how come he had a mother?" And my grandmother would say, "Don't argue with old people." But my grandmother was very kind and gentle, and I wasn't very scared of her. So I would tease her, "Grandmother, you know, he had a mother. How could he be the first person?" My grandmother also said, Kivio is still alive today, but he is so old, his body is turning to stone. And they say someday when his heart turns completely to stone and stops, that will be the end of the universe. And there are many stories about this man. Well, the very first story about Kivio was a story about a little boy. And this little boy loved to go out to play, but there were mean boys who lived in this camp. They would run after him, they would fight him, they would make him cry, they would rip up all his clothes, and the poor boy would go home to his grandmother because he was an orphan. He had no mother and no father, so he lived with his grandmother. And his poor old grandmother would take her needle and thread and she would sew his clothes all back together again. And the little boy would put on his clothes. He would go off to play. The mean boys would run after him. They would fight him. They would make him cry. They would rip up all his clothes. And his poor old grandmother had to sew them all back together again. One day, when the little boy came home, there was a little seal that somebody had caught for them, and it was lying on the floor. His grandmother said, "I would like you to skin that seal. So the little boy took a knife. He started to skin the seal. His grandmother said, be careful, don't put any holes in the skin. So very, very carefully, the little boy skinned the seal. And when he was all finished, his grandmother said, I would like you to take the seal skin and pull it over your head, and I would like you to put your head in that pail of water. There was a great big pail of water on the floor. So the little boy took the sealskin, he pulled it over his head so that it fit nicely in. He looked like a little seal. And then he took a deep breath and he stuck his head into this pail of water. He kept his head underwater as long as he could, and when his lungs hurt, he lifted his head and he went, and his grandmother said, do it again. So he took another deep breath and he stuck his head back into this pail of water. And he kept his head underwater as long as he could, going like this. You know what seals look like? They look like this. And he kept his head underwater as long as he could. And when he was just about to drown, he lifted his head and he went, and his grandmother said, do it again. Every time he lifted his head, his grandmother would say, do it again. He would take a deep breath and he would stick his head back into this pail of water. And you know, after a while, he could keep his head underwater for a long time. And an old man who lived in Kusugak in Nunavut, he told me that he could keep his head underwater so long he would move the sun. Have you ever tried to hold your breath until the sun moves? It takes a long time. And finally, his grandmother was satisfied that he could keep his head underwater long enough. She said, I would like you to go down to the beach. And when you're walking to the beach, make sure nobody sees you. And when you get to the water's edge, I would like you to take the sealskin and pull it over your head and jump into the water and go for a swim and come up right in front of all your mean friends who are playing on the beach. And sure enough, all the mean boys were playing on the beach. The little boy took the sealskin, he walked down to the beach. He made sure nobody saw him. And when he got to the water's edge, he took the sealskin, he pulled it over his head so that it fit nicely, and he looked like a little seal. And then he took a deep breath, and he jumped into the water. He went for a swim underwater, and he came up right in front of all the mean boys who were playing on the beach. They looked at him, and they said, hey, there's the little seal. They thought he was a little seal, and they all ran up. They grabbed their kayaks. They put their kayaks in the water. They hopped and they took their long paddles, and they started to paddle following the little seal. The little seal would go down underwater and he would swim a little bit farther out, and then he would come up again. And then he would go down and he would swim a little bit farther out, and then he would come up again. And the mean boys who fought him and made him cry and ripped all his clothes, they were paddling their kayak following along behind him. And it was a beautiful, beautiful day. And after a while, they were way out at sea. And when they were way out at sea, when the little seal came up, he would lift up his arm and his leg and he would sing, Ano ka na? Ano ka kaili? Unga, unga. And then he'd go down again. And he would swim a little bit farther out. And when he came up, he would lift up his arm and his leg and he would sing, where is my wind? I want my wind. And he would make a crying sound like a little baby. Wah, wah. People say the weather that was on the day you were born is your very own weather. And that is why, if you were born on a sunny day, usually the sun shines on your birthday. If you were born on a rainy day, usually it rains on your birthday. And this little boy was born on a very, very windy day. And he was calling the weather That was on the day he was born. Where is my wind? I want my wind. And he made a crying sound like a little baby. Well, well, just like the day he was born. The wind heard him, and it started to come. It got windier and windier and windier, and before long there were huge waves in the water. And the kayaks with all the mean boys were going up and down in the big waves. And every now and then a giant wave would come and it would flip the kayaks over. And before long, there was only one person left. That person was Kivio. Now, Kivio was very good with his kayak. He paddled his kayak on and on, going up and down in the big waves. And when a giant wave came and flipped his kayak over, he would roll it back up. He was really, really good with his kayak. And he kept on going. No matter how cold and wet and tired he got, he never gave up. He paddled his kayak on in the big storm, going up and down, and every time his kayak flipped over, he would roll it back up. And finally, after a long time, the wind stopped, and the sea became really, really still again. And Kiviok was so tired, he put his paddle on his lap, he put his head on his chest, and he fell asleep. He slept for a long time, and when he woke up, he sat up in his kayak, he stretched, he looked around, he looked all around, but there was nothing but water. He was way out in the middle of the ocean. And because he was way out in the middle of the ocean, he couldn't see any land anywhere. And because he couldn't see land, he didn't know which way to go. And while he was sitting there, he started to think about some strange and wonderful things. One of the things he thought about was this little feather he had on the back of his coat. You see, ever since he was a tiny little boy, his mother. See, I told you he had a mother. I told my grandmother he had a mother. His mother always sewed a little feather on the back of his coat. It was a feather from a little bird called a saukak. And a saukak is a little brown bird that swims in tiny ponds. And while it's swimming, it goes around in circles, around and round and round and round. And while it's going around in circles, it goes like this. They're funny little birds, and I love to watch them. And he had this little feather on the back of his coat, and he always wondered what it was for. And while he was sitting there, a little bird came. A little white bird, a snow bunting. You know, like the little bird that broke the window? It landed on his kayak. It looked at Kiviok and said, "Do you know which way to go?" And Kiviok said, "No, I don't know which way to go because there's nothing but water." And the little bird said, "Well, follow me." So he started to follow the little bird, and he paddled his kayak on, and after a long time, he saw this really thin line on the horizon, like a little piece of thread, and he thought it was land. So he paddled his kayak toward it. But after a while, it disappeared, and Kiviok said, it's disappeared again. It must have been a big wave. And the little bird looked at him again and said, "Do you know which way to go?" And Kiviok said, "No, I don't know which way to go because there's nothing but water." And the little bird said, "Well, follow me." So we start to follow the little bird again, and he paddled his kayak on, and after a long time, he saw this really thin line on the horizon, like a little piece of thread, and he thought it was land. So he paddled his kayak toward it, and this time, it did not disappear. It got thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker, and Kiviok landed his kayak way over on the other side of the ocean in this strange place. And you know, when I was a little boy and my grandmother told me that story, for the longest time, I didn't know the story had an ending because I always fell asleep. Well, that was the beginning of the Kivio legends. You know, when Kivio ended up on the other side of the ocean, it was a very strange place. The very first things he came across were giant spiders, and they started to chase him, and he had to run away. And then he found a strange igloo. It had no top. And when he walked up to it and looked inside, there was a giant bumblebee sitting on a bed, and it was cooking some strange stuff in a cooking pot. And every time he got into trouble, a little bird would come. You know that little bird he had in the back of his coat, the little brown one? That was his magic bird. And his magic bird, the white bird, and the little bird would help him. And he had all these adventures, and he got homesick. So he started traveling, trying to find his way home. And while Kivio was trying to find his way home, he traveled through every part of the north. So there are stories about him everywhere. If you go to Siberia, you can hear stories about Kivio. If you go to Alaska, you can hear stories about Kivio. We have Kivio stories all across northern Canada, and there are Kivio stories in Greenland too. And those are the stories that I heard when I was a little boy. When I was 6 years old, an airplane came, and this airplane took a bunch of us kids down to a place called Chesterfield Inlet to go to school. We had to live with a whole bunch of nuns and priests, and we had to go to school for the whole school year. It was one of those infant. I was only 6 years old. I missed my mother, I missed my father, I missed all my brothers and sisters. So I used to sit in the back of the class, and I would play with big wooden blocks, and I would cry and cry and cry. And that's all I remember about my first year of school. In the spring, the airplane came again. It took us back to Repulse Bay, and we had a wonderful summer. And in the fall, the airplane came again. It was going to take us back to school, but I really didn't want to go. So I ran away. I hid in the hills until I saw the airplane leave. After the airplane left, I went home and I skipped school for a whole year. But eventually, I had to go back to school because I had a little brother, and he turned 6, and they were hauling him away to school, and I decided I'd better go with them. So the second time I went away to school, I had a much better time because I had my little brother. Well, when I grew up, I got 4 boys. And when I only had 3 of them, I would put them to bed at night. And when I put my boys to bed, they would say, "Dad, can you read us a book?" They would get a book and I would read to them. And one night I got really, really tired of all those books. So we put them away, and I told my boys a story. And that story became a book called A Promise is a Promise. And I wrote this book with a friend of mine whose name is Robert Munch. And this came out 33 years ago. So it's been around for a long time. And we wrote another one, and we wrote this one in Inuktitut, in my language. And we wrote another one in French. And then I found another one that was made in Nova Scotia. It's in the language of the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. And we found another one, and this one was made in Greenland. And it's all written in Greenlandic Inuktitut. And when I was finished writing that book, I wrote a whole bunch more, and I started traveling around all over the place, and I would tell stories. And one day, we were in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I was telling stories at the Winnipeg Children's Festival. And when I was there, when I was all finished telling stories, they gave me a check for $1,000. And I was standing on the stage with my check when my wife came, and she said, "Can I have your check?" I said, okay. And I gave her my check and I said, what are you going to do with all that money? She said, I'm going to buy you a dog. And sure enough, the very next day, this little puppy arrived. It came from a place called Red Deer, Alberta. And when I got my little puppy, I called the kennels in Red Deer on the phone and I said, what do you call my puppy? They said, oh, we really don't have a name for her. We just call her U2. And I said, U2, like the rock band U2? And they said, no, just U2. I said, why do you call my dog U2? They said, it's because she never listens. And sure enough, I got this little puppy who never listened. She would sit there. And one day I was looking at her, trying to figure out what she was doing. And then I got it. You know what she liked to do? Daydream. You see, when she was a tiny, tiny puppy, her mother used to tell her stories. And what do dogs tell stories about? Other dogs, of course. Her mother told her stories about dogs from all around the world. And my little puppy would sit there and she would think, when I grow up, I'm going to be a great big St. Bernard dog. And she was going to go rescue skiers in the Alps, in the big mountains when they get caught in avalanches. And then she thought, oh, maybe not. When I grow up, I'm going to be a golden retriever, because she loved to run and splash in the water and she was going to fetch ducks for duck hunters. And then she thought, oh, maybe not. When I grow up, I'm going to be a great big sled dog. And sure enough, she came to live with me way up north in Rankin Inlet. And when I got her, I put her on the leash and we went for a walk and she pulled and pulled and pulled. She was practicing to be a sled dog. And one day we took her over to my mother's house and she was running around and my mother said, oh, what a cute puppy. What do you call her? I said, Mom, we really don't have a name for her. We just call her U2. And my mother said, what does that mean? Because my mother didn't speak any English. And I said, Mom, it means Igloo. And my mother said, oh, that's a nice name. Why don't you call her Igloo? So then I had a little puppy whose name was Igloo, and it means U2. And in the fall, it started to snow. It got colder and colder and colder, and she still had to go outside to pee and Anna. And when she went outside, she found the snow was really cold, and she would lift up her paws one after the other, trying not to keep them on the snow for too long because her paws were getting cold. And one day, she was trying to lift up all her paws all at the same time when she fell over. And I felt so sorry for my little puppy who had cold feet. So I went out and I bought her little booties. And after that, every time my little puppy wanted to go out in the cold, she would jump up on the couch, she would put up her little paws and I would put her little boots on and we would go outside. One day we went for a walk when she saw them, real sled dogs. They were huge and they were pulling this huge sled. There was a man sitting on a sled. He was saying, "Oi, oi, hot, 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 hot." And the lead dog, the biggest dog of them all, said, "Right, right, left, left, carefully now, slowly now." And they pulled and pulled, and finally they came to this long chain on the ground. And when they got there, their master took them off their harnesses and tied them up to the long chain. And then he opened up a great big box. And inside the box, there were huge chunks of frozen fish. He picked them up. He threw them at the dogs. And the dogs all started going, rah, 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 rah. They were trying to bite each other. They were trying to fight each other. And they were gulping down these huge chunks of frozen fish without hardly chewing on them at all. And my little puppy who wanted so much to be a great big sled dog, she pulled me over to the biggest one of them all, the big gray lead dog. The big dog just looked at her and said, "Grah! You stay away from my food or I'll eat you up. Your little booties and all." And my poor little puppy, she got so scared. She went yelp, 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 yelp all the way home. And behind her, she could hear the big dogs. Heh, heh, heh. They were really mean. And that night, after we had supper, I sat down on the couch. I turned the TV on, and my little puppy jumped up on the back of the couch where she likes to lie and watch TV. And then we started to watch her favorite movie. There was this beautiful girl walking along a yellow brick road, and she sang so beautifully, "Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are blue, and the dreams that you dare to dream really do come true." And right then and there, my little puppy decided, I'm not going to be a sled dog after all. I'm going to be a movie star. You know why? Because that girl in that movie has a little puppy that looks exactly like my little puppy. And I wrote the story down, and here it is, The Littlest Sled Dog. And if you find this book and you look at the very last picture in the book, there it is. That's my little dog, Igloo. So I travel around, and, when I go somewhere, I like to tell people what it's like to live in the North. And I say sometimes when the wind blows, there is so much snow flying around that you can't see anything at all. And if you go for a walk, you get lost right away. So when I was a little kid, sometimes we had to sit in our igloos for a long, 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 long time. And it got to be really, really boring. So I would say to my grandmother, "Anana Jack, I am so bored." And my grandmother would say, "Why don't we play a game?" And I'd say, "But grandmother, we don't have any toys." And my grandmother said, "But we have the best toy in the world." And she would take out a piece of string. And I'd say, "But grandmother, that's not a toy, that's just a piece of string." And my grandmother said, "But this is very special string. This is magic string. This is string that does not like to be tied to your fingers. It always comes off." And she would tie up her fingers like this. And sure enough, her string always came off. And she would say, "Even if you tie up your fingers really good and tight, this string still does not like to be tied to your fingers. It always comes off." And she would tie up her fingers, and sure enough, her string always came off. And she would say, "Even if you tie up your fingers any old way, just tie them up any old way like this string still does not like to be tied to your fingers. It always comes off." So we played with the string for a long time, and before we knew it, the wind was all gone and we could go outside to play again. We played a game called Cat's Cradle. And you play Cat's Cradle with two people. And I have played this game with people all over the world. People all over the world know how to play Cat's Cradle. But we didn't call it Cat's Cradle because we didn't have cats, which is really quite all right because I am allergic to them anyway. And we learned how to make some string figures. And my grandmother said, if you learn how to make these string figures, you have to rub the string on your forehead like this so that you'll remember how to do it the next time. And I think I have the greatest job in the world because I get to meet lots and lots of people. And one day I was showing this to a bunch of tiny little kids. One little boy looked at it and he said, I know what that is. I know what that is. I said, what? He said, it's a butterfly with underwear. But that's not underwear. That's a kayak. You know, those long, skinny skin boats? This is the bow, the front part, this is turn the back part, and this round hole is where you sit and you paddle your boat along the water like this. Except the mean boys were going. Well, you have questions, I hear.
Yes, we have some questions. So one of them was, how old were you when you decided to write your book?
How old was I? I think I was 36 years old, something like that.
Did you play sports as a kid?
Yeah, I played all kinds of sports. I tried to play hockey once, but my feet hurt when I had skates on. But we used to play soccer. Yeah, mostly soccer outside, and we played baseball with rubber balls.
Have you ever seen a seal?
Lots of them, lots and lots and lots of them. Yeah, we lived on seals when I was a kid, because you know seal meat is really really amazing stuff. If you eat it, it actually makes you warm. And if you live in a cold country, you know, the best thing you can eat is seal meat or some meat from the aquatic animals, because they actually, the fat, when you eat the fat, it actually burns in your body and it makes you warm from the inside. So it's really, really good for you.
So one comment was that the favorite book that you've written is A Promise is a Promise. And they asked what your favorite book is that you wrote.
My favorite book, what?
The favorite book that you wrote.
Baseball Bats for Christmas is one of them. And the other one is this book here, Northern Lights of Soccer Trails, because I get more letters from people about this book than any other book I have ever written. It's a story about a girl whose name is Katauya, which means rainbow. And her mother dies and she's really sad, but then her grandmother tells her a story about the Northern Lights, because we believe when you die, your soul goes up into the heavens, and on a clear moon at night, all those people up there like to go out and they like to have a good time too. So what they do is they play soccer. And then Katauya can see her mother again up in the sky, and it makes her feel so much better that her mother has not really gone away. And this won a very major children's book award called the Ruth Schwartz Award. And it's been translated into many different languages. Like there's a French version. This is an English version. There's a Korean version, a Japanese version, and this one also is in Braille. These plastic pages have little bumps. That's Braille. And another book you should know about is a chapter book. This is called The Curse of the Shaman. And I wrote it in 2008. And we're republishing it with HarperCollins. And that story I told you about the mean boys and Kivio, it's in this book. On page 61, there's a chapter called The Beginning of the Kivio Legends. And that is the story I told you. And this book is being used in schools all over the north because it talks about people Inuit before there was any contact with the outside world. So it's just straight Inuit. It's a story about an Inuit families, or two families actually. Yeah.
So some of them ask, are your stories true? So I guess, are they fictional or non-fictional?
They are. I make them up. Most of them, except for Baseball Bat for Christmas, it's a true story. It's a story about the first trees we ever saw. And they came to Nauyat or Repulse Bay when I was 6 years old or 7 years old, the year I skipped school. And we had never seen trees before. So we didn't know what they were and we didn't know what they were for. They were actually Christmas trees. But we made them into baseball bats and they were the best Christmas presents we ever got. Because that's one of the sports that we like to play, baseball, well, with a rubber ball anyway.
A couple have asked, do you still have your dog and what type of dog is it?
No, our dog passed away about 4 years ago. It was a Cairn Terrier. And it's just like, the dog in The Wizard of Oz, that movie. Toto is that dog's name. But sometime when we're all settled down and we're not traveling so much anymore, we're going to get another dog, and so she'll be reborn.
I have a couple comments saying how much they love your stories and how much they've had fun listening to you today. There was one I just wanted to read to you here. It says, I enjoyed listening to your stories with my children. I'm originally from in Manitoba. I spent quite a bit of time enjoying the woods as a small boy and as an adult, and think there's a lot of value in taking the children out to help them see the other parts of the world around us and how the land can provide and how to respect the gifts. So when you mentioned that about no wars between the northern people, he thought of his brother my older brother has always said if we woke up every day and had to concentrate on getting food, there would be far less problems in the world. So when you mentioned about no wars between the northern people, he thought of his brother and laughed. So he just wanted to let you know that your time was appreciated by him and his daughters, and wanted to say thank you.